Welcome to this online event, part of the Sheffield Chamber Music Festival 2021. My name is Patrick Bailey. To all of Music in the Round's audience, thank you so much for your generosity in the last year. Every gift you made us has enabled us to keep bringing events free to people and music closer to people. If you're able to donate, please do so. Every gift we receive is really important to us. Details of how to donate are below this window where you're watching the film. Thank you. Tonight's concert contains 4 works by the composer Igor Stravinsky, one of the giants or geniuses of 20th century music. They also show Stravinsky's fascination and enthusiasm for other people's music. 3 of them are chamber arrangements or adaptations of pieces that originally existed in theatrical contexts. I think Stravinsky realised quite soon on that a piece of music to be performed by a handful of players was more likely to get more performances than one that needed the full resources of a theatre or a ballet company. The 4 pieces date from 1918 to 1953 and capture a really interesting snapshot in Stravinsky's artistic and kind of compositional journey. The earliest piece, The Soldier's Tale, was written at the end of the First World War and is a sparse touring theatrical production. And then we then head to 2 of the great ballets from the 1920s, Pulcinella and The Fairy's Kiss, and we end up in the elegant austerity of 1950s America with the very pristine and beautiful Septet. The name given to this period in Stravinsky's life is neoclassical, and neoclassicism was an aesthetic that embraced many art forms in the 1920s and the first half of the 20th century. It took its inspiration from the previous classical period, that of the Age of Enlightenment in the 18th century. But the name feels quite restrictive when applied to Stravinsky, I think, because although he did find inspiration from the 18th century, he also found inspiration from the 17th and the 19th and the 20th, so he was neoclassical and neo-Baroque and neo-romantic. In fact, he was generally neo-anything. This range of composers is really worth marvelling at. The music to the Suite Italienne for violin and piano comes from the ballet Pulcinella and is based on the music of, not of Pergolesi as originally thought, but of other Italian Baroque composers. The music for Divertimento, also for violin and piano, is from the ballet The Fairy's Kiss, and here Stravinsky explores the music of his compatriot Tchaikovsky. The Septet, the largest of tonight's pieces in terms of forces, uses music by Schoenberg and Webern as its source and the idea of composing in a serial way. While as there are many, countless, nameless composers of dance forms like tangos and waltzes and ragtimes that provide the source material for the dance numbers in The Soldier's Tale. Over the last few days, I've spoken with 4 members of Ensemble 360, Benjamin Nabarro, Gemma Rosefield, Matthew Hunt and Tim Horton, and we've been talking about their experiences of playing this music of Stravinsky and their understanding of the sort of things that go on in order for him to reimagine other composers' music. My first conversation was with Ben, and we talked about the piece Suite Italienne for violin and piano. Ben, Stravinsky uses Pergolesi, or the Italian, or what we think is Pergolesi, and the Italian Baroque as the sort of starting point for Pulcinella and for the Suite Italienne. Do you play much music from the Italian Baroque yourself?
I don't actually. It's not a huge amount of what I do, and certainly most of the Baroque music that I play or played is Bach and things like that for the violin. And as you said, these Pergolesi things, that music that Stravinsky used, which turned out, in fact, to be by other composers as well as Pergolesi. It's interesting because I've known Suite Italienne for a long time, since I was a child, but I never actually heard the original pieces until really recently. In fact, only a few weeks ago, because I heard them on the radio. And I was really surprised as to how incredibly, I always knew that how Stravinsky treated the music, and that's to say that he didn't really do all that much to change the fundamentals of the music. But to hear some of these themes, some of these pieces in their original form was really incredible, because it really does sound very similar, and yet not at all like Stravinsky, which is where the sort of genius lies, I think.
So what does, can you put your finger on what Stravinsky does to make it sound like Stravinsky and make it more than just pastiche?
Well, yes, I think technically speaking, he, by and large, the theme is usually the same, exactly the same. And the bass line is more or less the same. And then in between, he does very subtle things to the harmony. We have things like called appoggiaturas in music, where you sort of stress on a particular note, and it's usually a dissonance, and then it's resolved. For instance, and sometimes Stravinsky would leave in these dissonances unresolved, which kind of jars with the harmony slightly, but it's always in a very subtle way. Or he might put one chord on top of another chord in a way that the original Baroque composer wouldn't have done. Again, to make this kind of slightly sort of, I wouldn't say confused, but a kind of juxtaposition of different harmonies at the same time. And then I suppose the other thing he does is articulation, which he plays around with a lot. But the main thing I think is, one of the main things is the orchestration, of course, because of course this piece started life as a ballet, a one-act ballet, and then became a suite for orchestra. And the way Stravinsky orchestrates these pieces is very unusual and very sort of idiosyncratic. And so he'll have, for instance, you might hear, I can't remember which one it was now, but I heard one of the clips because Stravinsky was on the radio a lot a few weeks ago, and they played an example of one of the, either Pergolesi or one of the other composers. And then they went straight to the bit in Suite Italienne, which is played as a trombone solo. And basically it's the same harmony and the same tune, the same music, but because it was played on the trombone and orchestrated in such a way that you would never, of course, dream of in the Baroque time, it suddenly sounds like completely different music, which sounds like an obvious thing to say, really, but somehow it's not so obvious when you hear it. Even if you have a sort of trained musical ear, you can quite easily be disorientated, I think. And so yeah, I think it's I've heard it described as Stravinsky looking back over this music, sort of written hundreds of years ago, through his own kind of eyes, if you see what I mean. And I think that's what he was doing. I mean, I don't think he regarded it as pastiche or I don't think he liked any of the labels really that people put on the music subsequently. But yeah, for him, I think it was looking at the music, and I think he just had he fell in love with this music when it was Diaghilev's idea to put this music forward for the ballet. And he fell in love with it, and also liked the idea of the story, the story of Pulcinella, and so yeah, it went from there. And I think he just loved the music and wanted to kind of, it's a bit like sort of a composer interpreting the music through their own kind of musical sensibilities, I suppose.
Do you get a sense that sort of slight detachment we get from this sort of style galant, the Rococo, late high Baroque that Pergolesi and his contemporaries come from, and Stravinsky's own approach? Is that something you feel, or do you feel there's kind of more of an emotional connection with the piece, it being more 20th century and more open to that?
Yeah, I know it is definitely does have a sort of slightly more detached. I mean, when you compare the music, how it comes across and how it sounds compared to the period that came before it for Stravinsky, of course, which is so lavish, the Russian style and all the kind of orchestration he did with Firebird and all those sorts of pieces. And so this is so different, isn't it? And the kind of the style of the music, as you say, coming from that period, the material that he used is much more sort of detached and. But having said that, there's some really moving and very kind of in an understated way. It's a very sort of incredibly beautiful kind of singing arias and things like that. And I'm thinking of the second movement, the Sicilian movement. I've forgotten what it's called now, but Serenata.
Yes,
And
Serenata,
yeah, and so yeah, I think it is. I mean, it certainly marks a very important moment in Stravinsky's career and life when he started to. This is what people think of. I think is the moment where he started his neoclassical period. So it is quite an important piece from that. And of course, yeah, as you say, it's such a different musical language from what came before, with all the sort of big Russian style, if you like, stuff, and certainly the ballets that had come before, Firebird, Petrushka, and Rite of Spring, and
yeah, it shows how fashions were changing so quickly in Paris, in a way, doesn't it? In the 1920s, that the decade previous, Diaghilev had been really pushing the sort of Russian folklore and the exoticism of kind of pagan Russia and so on. By here, he's trying to create, again, Diaghilev as the artistic lead, trying to find something much more refined and much more kind of elegant, and it's a very different aesthetic, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's amazing how Stravinsky just put that up and did something so incredibly different.
Next, I spoke with Matthew Hunt, who sadly is unable to play in tonight's concert, but he has a great passion for Stravinsky and a great knowledge of his music, and our discussion centred around The Soldier's Tale. Matt, the other three works in the concert tonight kind of openly reference other composers' music, but The Soldier's Tale, which is the earliest of tonight's pieces, doesn't sort of borrow in quite the same way, but instead uses kind of popular musical forms, and particularly I'm thinking of the tango and the waltz and the ragtime. The tango and the ragtime are both kind of quite contemporary to The Soldier's Tale. They'd only really emerged in Europe in the previous sort of decade or so. What do you think attracted Stravinsky to this music?
That's very interesting. I suppose he must have come across it, first of all, probably in Paris, I imagine. And I think, of course, he was the great kind of revolutionary at the beginning of the 20th century, the bad boy who ripped it all up and shocked the world. But actually, really, as you say, he was this great musical magpie who went around taking things that fascinated him, polishing them so they still stay what they originally were, and yet becoming absolutely, totally recognizably Stravinsky. It always fascinates me that, like, all the neoclassical stuff, I'm kind of hot-wired to be deeply moved by it, just by the sort of very sound. Put on Dumbarton Oaks, and it goes straight into me, in a way that sometimes that particular style of music doesn't. But his voicing of things and stuff is so fascinating and just so beautiful. I think he must have heard ragtime and jazz in Paris. He wrote quite a bit for the clarinet and the piano in jazz. The last of his three solo pieces is a real jazz, but it's not jazz. It's Stravinsky's kind of impression of jazz. It's like he's not trying to write jazz. It's like he's writing him in a jazz club with notes kind of buzzing around his head. The three dances in Soldier's Tale, I think it's very interesting because the version in the festival is with the little trio version. The big version with 7 instruments, the tango, is amazing because obviously that was very much in vogue then. And Stravinsky writes this accompaniment for the violin just in percussion. And it's sort of incredibly dramatic and very dark and treacly somehow, or sort of, there's an awful lot of plum jam. I suppose it's probably more like Malbec or some kind of Argentinian grape that we can see kind of meshing itself. Really absolutely fabulous. The waltz then, of course, is just like, it becomes very it's somebody turning a handle on a musical box that plays this waltz that and it's very simple until Stravinsky interrupts it, and suddenly there's a kind of bomb, and then you're back into this very polite waltzing. I think that's the least extraordinary, in a way, of the three dances. But what is amazing in that is that it breaks into the ragtime. So it doesn't go straight into the ragtime. He keeps on adding in, so he keeps on putting in hemiola. So rather than going 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, it's sort of he puts in, and he asks them to be very, very punctuated, very kind of accentuated actually, and with an awful lot of kind of daggers written over the notes. He clearly wants to destabilize your kind of nice, comfortable waltz. And this ragtime kind of keeps on peeking through all these holes that he puts in the waltz. And then it breaks out into the ragtime full. I mean, then once it's gone, the waltz. And the ragtime is very much Stravinsky's impression of ragtime. And I'm kind of fascinated with what he heard as ragtime. It's not like his piano ragtime in feel. It's much more jazz club and small band, and the stuff kind of written for the trombone going wah wah wah. It seems to me kind of very real, and the clarinet line, I kind of imagine a lovely 1920s saxophone. But again, then it has this almost laid back feel, and then suddenly the rhythm is set. It sets too, and it feels like kind of carrying a hot potato. And it's like you're desperately trying to hold on to the rhythm and remember it's 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 3 1 2 and grabbing at it. And it's like fast and furious, and I mean so much fun to play. But I've been playing it for years and years, and I still have to concentrate so hard. Actually, it's the hardest is when you're not playing, coming in right at the next part. But they're really, as always with Stravinsky, when he takes something, they're three extraordinarily glowing versions of what it is he's, in a way, parodying.
Yeah, absolutely. I was thinking, you listening to you describe the kind of the rhythmic challenges of that music, and your kind of fixation on having to subdivide and think in quavers throughout. It reminded me also of the march that starts the whole piece off, the famous march again, which is another parody of a sort of Sousa-esque type of march, where if you listen to double bass in the original or piano in this trio version, the bass line is actually quite strict in two. But around that, it seems to me that the other instruments slip out by a quaver either side of that. I mean, is that your impression of it too?
It's not my impression. I think that's absolute fact. So you'd expect it to be going 1 2 1 2 1 2 1, and that is what you hear: 1 2 1 2, bomb bomb bomb. But over this, suddenly you're having to count 1 2 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 4 1 2 1, and but that, which is very possible, but not when somebody is just going at you, and it takes a long time to really kind of internalize that and really be totally sure that you're coming in the right place, because of course I think the reason why Stravinsky does it is not to sort of destabilize performers, but really because he wants it to be grouped like that. He wants to feel that we're pulling against it. There are some moments where I still, even though I kind of know what's going to happen, I still have to count like absolute crazy. But yeah, the march is one of the more complicated things.
It sort of reminds me of Picasso in that you can see two perspectives simultaneously. You know, so you're seeing an eye looking forward, but a nose looking sideways.
Yeah.
And both those things at the same time. Because you've played both versions of the piece so often, you've played the original septet and you've played the trio version. Is there sometimes a confusion moving between the two? Is it because the similar clarinet parts, but suddenly something quite different looms up? Is that a confusion or a tricky?
So I've played, I suppose, the trio version more often than the full version. That's not too confusing. Every now and then I forget that when I play the big version that somebody else is playing what I think is my part. And that's like, hey, stop it. But I have to live with that. That's not too confusing. What is the challenge in playing the big version is that there's some of the music that he doesn't include in the little suite, is things like the Grand March and stuff. It is ferocious. And that piece is again one that needs huge concentration. Stravinsky can like really get into your soul, and yet there's something cool about it. There's something very, this is how it is. There's he's always kind of well dressed. I think
that's a current that runs through all four pieces. All four pieces have a slight distance to them. There's him, Stravinsky, looking at someone else's music, looking in an 18th century mirror or a 19th century mirror, but the reflection he sees, you say, is his very well dressed self.
Yeah, and of course he didn't start like that. I mean, all his early stuff is very late romantic. I mean, even when you think of the Firebird, you know, this is great, huge impressionistic washes, which of course totally goes. I suppose you could say a little bit that about The Rite of Spring, that in terms of sort of the sounds that he asks for, but then of course he becomes this super precise, you know, all his like different colored pencils. But he knows exactly what he's doing. He knows exactly which color, he knows exactly what sound, and how to mix them. And I don't think he ever loses that. I think that precision and that absolute elegance always remains.
I spoke with cellist Gemma Rosefield about the Septet, and we started by talking about where this piece sits in Stravinsky's developing musical world. Gemma, how aware are you of where the Septet lies in Stravinsky's musical journey in terms of kind of the place it occupies in his own development as a composer?
I think Stravinsky's a composer who's got so many faces and masks, and he sort of looks back. He's looked back so often in you know his music, but he still manages to sort of feel in that moment contemporary. And the Septet really is one of the first pieces, I think, that was entirely based on serial. It was entirely serial music, basically. So completely based on 6 notes, which is the da 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 da, which is the wrong notes because I don't have perfect pitch, but it's A, E, D, C, B, A. And the way he passes that through the instruments, he starts off with it in the clarinet, then the bassoon has exactly that melody as far as I can remember, but in a very different time sort of sphere, and then the horn plays exactly that melody but inverted. So it's just incredibly clever how he manages to do that. And I'm pretty sure he wrote it after hearing the Schoenberg Septet Suite, and he was a big admirer of Schoenberg. Unfortunately, I don't think it was reciprocal.
But it's for the same instrumentation, I think, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It's very closely based on that for sure. But it's it's sort of trying to enter into that world, and it does so just brilliantly, I think, while also still being very much Stravinsky in terms of harking back to older worlds. Like he entitles the last movement a jig, and like he's based the second movement on a Bach Passacaglia. So many things that are still harking back while being incredibly compact and concise based on these 6 notes.
Gemma, have you played much other serial music, the sort of second Viennese stuff like Schoenberg or Webern, for instance?
So I probably have played more than this, but off the top of my head, I can think of the Webern 3 pieces for cello and piano, which are incredibly compact and concise, but you feel like you've had a whole lifetime in those sort of 3 minutes. They're only about a minute each. And also the Schoenberg String Trio, which is larger, but also incredibly intense and quite a challenge to learn, actually.
That's really interesting, because I think that's how I think of when I think of Webern. I think of it being really kind of condensed, the music, the barest ideas. And I think in this Stravinsky, the Septet, the second movement starts in a similar way, where the intervals are quite wide and quite quite kind of, they leap around a lot. There's no spare notes in between them. Does that relate back to the Webern at all?
Definitely. I mean, the second movement of Stravinsky, I think, was based on a Bach Passacaglia in C minor. So it's again looking at this harking back that Stravinsky is sort of known as doing, harking back to a different time in music, but making it very much his own by how he puts the notes together and how he passes from the different instruments to each other. And in the Webern, which was for cello and piano, I mean, he definitely does that again in much more compact, concise way. I mean, the movements really do only last a minute, if that, each. But yes, the way he goes from a very, very high harmonic to a very low muted sound on the cello and then handing over to the piano seamlessly is incredible and very intense.
What are the challenges for the ensemble when you're preparing a work like the Septet?
Well, there are many challenges, I suppose, but to start off with, a piece like the Septet, you have to be incredibly precise, both rhythmically and with your, how on top of your part you are. But it's also incredibly hard to practice it on your own at the same time. So you have to have really, really prepared your part. You have to know the score inside out. But then when you come together, you have to almost have a slight distance at the beginning in terms of, because sometimes the other parts can be so off-putting to what you're actually doing with your part. So it's really getting that balance between, if you really know your part and the score before you meet, and then get to know it again, because knowing the score, is one thing on your own, but again, hearing the other instruments can be very off-putting or helpful, or really help the section. So it's getting that balance, I suppose, and it needs incredible precision, this music, while also, it's music. It's you have to find the emotional heart of it. So
yeah, that's true. I mean, you have to kind of like, what are the priorities in rehearsal? Because as you say, it's all 7 parts are treated fairly equally but and you can't always work out who's writing is whose. When you look at the score, if you didn't have the name of the instruments, you wouldn't say, well, that's the bassoon part or that's the cello part, because he doesn't seem to make much difference between the instruments. He just writes the notes he wants to write. But
yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, so you still want your personalities and your instruments to come out. So it must be a hard balance to find.
But that's what I find so utterly brilliant about it, actually, the way he seamlessly goes from the bassoon to the cello to the clarinet, to the piano, to the viola. It's so seamless, particularly in the second movement, actually, of the Septet. It's just incredible how he does that and builds up this intensity while going through these very, very different instruments. They have very different timbres, everything, but it builds up this incredible intensity it's very special. Yeah.
My final conversation was with pianist Tim Horton, undoubtedly the person with the most notes to play in tonight's concert. We were talking about the divertimento, based on music from the ballet The Fairy's Kiss, which in turn is based on the music of Tchaikovsky. Tim, hi. With other people in your ensemble, we've been looking at a lot of kind of neoclassical Stravinsky, or neo-Baroque Stravinsky, if you like, which has a kind of, at the heart of it, a sense of objectivity, both the Stravinsky's objectivity of looking at a distant composer, but also that period of music's kind of natural objectivity as well. But the divertimento from the ballet The Fairy's Kiss is based on Tchaikovsky, which is something else completely, isn't it? It's sort of full-bodied romanticism. And for the first 2 minutes of the piece, I kind of get the sense when I listen to it that it's difficult to identify Stravinsky, but then he sort of starts to reveal himself, doesn't he, after a while? And I just want to ask you first, what does he do to kind of uncloak himself and show us that Stravinsky is here behind Tchaikovsky?
Well, it's funny. I hate to disagree in some ways, but I think that actually the Stravinsky is there quite early on in this piece, purely because of the way that he goes about. I don't know how you'd say. I mean, recomposing, deconstructing, whatever the term is, whatever composer he's addressing, or whatever form he's addressing. Because of course, his use of ragtime or whatever, that's also neoclassical, if you like, even though it's contemporary form. I think one of the ways he does it is by, it's a very familiar thing, and you have it from Pulcinella probably earlier onwards, is by, first of all, mixing up different harmonies that you would normally have separated. Yeah. So if you have a tonic harmony, so say if you're in F minor, which the beginning of this piece is, and you have the dominant, so C, and then the subdominant, B flat, he will scrunch a lot of these harmonies together. But the voice leading, in other words, the way the different voices, say, the piano will have 3 or 4 voices going on at once and the violin another one. He will have the voice leading, in other words, those different voices will occur as if they are original, but they will just go slightly in the wrong direction, if you like, from what we might expect from Tchaikovsky.
Yeah.
So
quite subtle, that, isn't it? It's you very can hear it. You hear it, but you don't really know you're hearing it unless you're looking out for it, I think.
And it's interesting because, of course, so many composers around that time, if you think of Bartók or Hindemith, there are so many composers using sort of bitonal elements, so 2 different keys at the same time, which in certain situations is very obvious. And Stravinsky, it's almost never obvious in that sense. But it's interesting what you say about the subjectivity, the objectivity of the music, because even though this is Tchaikovsky, very little known Tchaikovsky, a lot of it, it still has that slightly, it depends who you talk to about this, it has that slightly arm's length feeling sometimes. And I know people who might love Petrushka, Rite of Spring, they might love In Memoriam, Dylan Thomas, all the stuff on the outside, but the neoclassic stuff, I know people who struggle with it because they find it, if you like, desiccated in some way, emotionally remote, which I don't really agree with, I have to say. The more I play this stuff, I think because of the way he's written it, it seems objective. There are very few markings. It's not like Alban Berg, where you have 6 markings on every bar, and there's very little he gives you. It's almost he's deliberately going back to a sort of Baroque mindset where he doesn't give you very much, and so it looks objective. But of course, if you play it like that, it's just rather tedious. You have to actually play it as if it's Tchaikovsky, I suppose.
which is interesting, isn't it? Because in moments of this piece, like say for instance the scherzo, I was thinking that actually there's a lot of inherent rubato in that music, isn't it? It almost has to be in order to play it, but also it needs space to breathe. But Stravinsky offers none of those clues compared to a lot of 20th century composers, where I'm thinking it's like Copland even, who just absolutely takes to the last detail exactly how you should play the piece. But Stravinsky leaves it to your instinct, your knowledge.
I think that's it. I think you have to approach it. We're playing a lot of. I've never played so much Stravinsky in 1 week as I'm doing this week, or one sort of concentrated patch. I think you have to. My view is you have to play it as if it is the thing that he's referencing, in a way. So all the gestures, the sort of musical gestures, the rubato that you would naturally feel, I think you have to just naturally feel those anyway. And it just so happens that the harmonies don't necessarily come at the places that you expect them to. But there's so much music in here that's it is incredibly well characterized, as well as anything else, and you have to play it as if it's characterized,
I was thinking that listening to it earlier on, the kind of reminding myself of the pas de deux, the sort of final movement, and the very balletic gestures in that, the sort of fluttery offbeats and all sorts of things that you would. The gestures completely redolent of Tchaikovsky ballets to my ear.
Absolutely, Actually, funnily enough, I've been getting to know my daughter is hugely. She's only 6, and she's really now very, very fond of Tchaikovsky ballets. I just bought her a CD of all of the complete Tchaikovsky ballet, which I didn't really know. I knew the famous bits, I knew the Nutcracker Suite, and now I've been listening to a lot of those, and they're. So much better than I realised they were.
I remember the first time I heard the Nutcracker live on stage or saw it, I was bowled over by the music I didn't know, which I thought was just tremendous.
Exactly.
The piano writing, are you able to relate kind of how Tchaikovsky uses the piano and how Stravinsky uses the piano? Is there a similarity in this music, or is it so recognisably Stravinsky?
No, I think it doesn't. To me, I haven't played much Tchaikovsky piano music. I've played more chamber music, but the trio, for example. But it doesn't. It seems like Stravinsky to me. and it's as unforgiving as a lot of Stravinsky piano music is, because of course he had enormous hands, and I really don't. So I have to.
Is that a Russian trait? I'm thinking of.
It
Rachmaninoff
seems to be
as well.
exactly, exactly. But it's different to Rachmaninoff. Even it's even more. I mean, Rachmaninoff was a great pianist, of course. He knew. I mean, Stravinsky was a very, very good pianist. Don't get me wrong, but it seems to be even less. He doesn't really care whether you've got the same size hands as he does. So there's a lot of rearranging I have to do, a lot of sort of subtle stuff. I hope subtle anyway, to get around it. But it doesn't remind me of Tchaikovsky's piano style at all.
Do you have any sense, Tim, why Stravinsky chose to revisit Tchaikovsky? Because it's quite a different sort of composer to other composers he had kind of worked from, as it were. Do you get any sense of why? What
I don't know.
The Russian heritage, I think.
I suspect, because I think I'm right in saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, that this is the only time he did reference Tchaikovsky directly.
I think so.
And this is what, late 20s, 28, 27, 28, I think.
That's right. Yeah. Exactly.
Originally, I don't know, and I'm embarrassed to say I haven't read enough about it. My suspicion is he was. There was a commission. Any Russian composer of that time has to acknowledge Tchaikovsky as something, as part of the heritage. I know Rimsky-Korsakov was closer to Stravinsky stylistically, and much more of a direct influence. But I suppose you never know with Stravinsky, do you? Because you never quite know what he meant, because he contradicted himself in interviews throughout his life. You never really know where he was coming from. And he was a little bit of a musical opportunist in some ways, wonderful though it all is.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I mean, I think he obviously saw maybe the subject matter of the ballet itself, so the Hans Christian Andersen story. Maybe he saw something in that where he thought, well, actually, this sort of style would suit it best, or something. I really don't know, but it's the thing. What's extraordinary about all this period of Stravinsky is no matter who he references, no matter whose music he's depends where you're coming from, using or paying homage to, it always sounds like Stravinsky.